The morning the lake disappeared, I knew Linda had crossed a line she could never walk back from. By sunrise, the air over the water smelled dry, metallic, and wrong, like the whole place had been holding its breath overnight, and suddenly remembered it was dying. I stood at the edge of the dock and stared at what used to be my private lake, the kind of water that looked so clean it almost felt unreal. Now it was gone. In its place was a cracked basin of mud, exposed earth, and stranded boats leaning at crooked angles under the pale morning light. The marina the HOA had proudly called a community project was no marina at all anymore. It was just a row of expensive structures leading nowhere, stripped of purpose in a single night. A white hole groaned somewhere to my left as it sank deeper into the drying ground, and the sound made the whole scene feel less like a neighborhood problem and more like the aftermath of a disaster nobody wanted to admit had happened. People were already gathering behind me, their voices rising in confusion, but I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the center of the basin, on the deepest point of the lake that had once made this entire development look polished and complete. That was where everything had started. And that was where it had just come apart. Linda Graves arrived a few minutes later, walking fast in heels that clicked sharply against the wooden planks, her face fixed in the same expression she wore at every board meeting, composed, certain, and slightly offended that anyone else had the nerve to exist outside her control. She had spent months selling this marina as proof that the HOA was improving the neighborhood, that it was adding value, that it was creating something shared and beautiful for everyone to enjoy. In her version of reality, a polished brochure mattered more than a property line, and a vote mattered more than ownership. That was always her move. She wrapped pressure in courtesy, then called it leadership. She sent notices, issued fines, and spoke in the language of community, while slowly tightening her grip on anything she thought she could claim. It started with a $50 fine because I missed a neighborhood barbecue, then turned into $100 because I refused to participate more constructively. To her, those were small things, harmless reminders that I was expected to cooperate. To me, they were the first signs that she had confused authority with entitlement. I watched her work the crowd for weeks, smiling at neighbors, praising the board, speaking as if the lake itself had been waiting for her approval. All the while, I had been checking records, reading old maps, and tracing the property history that most people here had never bothered to question. Linda thought silence meant surrender. What it really meant was that I was learning exactly how far she had drifted from the truth. As the Marina project reached its final stage, I already knew something was wrong, but I hadn't yet proved how wrong it was. The county files were buried in layers of old language, and the water rights documents were the kind of thing most people would ignore after 2 pages because the wording was too dry, too technical, too easy to dismiss. But I kept reading. I found the Conservation Trust, the restricted drainage system, and the private management records that showed the lake basin had been governed long before the subdivision ever existed. The HOA had authority over landscaping, shoreline appearance, and neighborhood rules. It did not have authority over the water system itself. It did not have the right to claim the basin as a shared amenity. And it certainly did not have the right to build a marina while pretending ownership had already been settled. That was the first real crack in Linda's carefully polished story. The second was the outflow control system, a private mechanism designed to regulate lake levels during heavy rain. The records made one thing obvious: if the water ever needed to be moved, the decision belonged to the trust, not the board. That meant the key I had tucked away in my desk drawer was not a weapon, not a threat, and not some dramatic symbol of revenge. It was proof that the system existed, that it had been there all along, and that Linda had never bothered to ask the one question that mattered most: who actually controlled the water? By the end of that morning, I knew this wasn't going to stay a local dispute for long. It was going to become a correction, and Linda had no idea yet that she was standing at the edge of it. The first real conflict with Linda didn't begin with the lake or the marina. It began with a small piece of paper taped to my mailbox, the kind of notice most people would glance at once and throw away. $50 for missing the neighborhood barbecue. That was how she chose to introduce herself as the person in charge, not with a conversation, but with a penalty. When I ignored it, the fine doubled, and the wording became more aggressive, as if the size of the number could somehow turn her opinion into policy. Linda had a way of speaking that made everything sound official, even when it was obvious she was making it up as she went. She used phrases like community standards, resident cooperation, and shared responsibility, the way other people use lockpicks. Every sentence was designed to make you feel like resistance was unreasonable, and if you pushed back, she acted as though you were the problem for noticing. I remember standing at my gate while she explained that the HOA had to keep people engaged, as if participation were a debt I had somehow failed to pay. Behind her, the lake sat calm and untouched, reflecting the evening sky, while she stood there treating a backyard social event like a legal obligation. That was the moment I understood that Linda did not think she was being controlling. She thought she was being righteous. And people who believe they are righteous are often the most difficult to stop because they never see their own behavior as a choice. After that, every interaction with her felt like the beginning of a pressure campaign. A reminder letter arrived. Then another. Then someone from the board stopped by to mention that the Marina project was moving forward and that homeowners were expected to support it. Support it, not vote on it, not review it, not question it. Support it. Linda made sure every conversation pointed in the same direction. She wanted my silence to look like approval. She wanted my refusal to attend meetings to become evidence that I was not a team player. It was absurd, but it was also familiar, because people like her rely on making other people tired. If they can wear you down long enough, they don't have to prove they're right. They just have to keep talking until you stop answering. So I did the opposite. I started listening more carefully. I read every notice she sent. I tracked every phrase she used. I pulled the subdivision records, the older land maps, and the trust documents that everyone else had ignored because they looked too complicated to matter. The more I read, the clearer it became that Linda was building her entire Marina project on assumptions she had never verified. She talked as if the lake had always been hers to manage, but the paperwork said otherwise. She talked as if the board's approval could replace real authority, but the paperwork said otherwise. And the more she pushed, the more I realized she wasn't just overconfident, she was exposed. She had built an entire system of control on top of a property line she hadn't bothered to understand. What made it worse was that the neighborhood bought into her version of events because it was easier than digging for the truth. The Marina looked good in pictures. The launch event sounded impressive. The word community softened everything it touched, and Linda knew exactly how to use that. She framed the project as an improvement for everyone, even while quietly collecting fees and acting like the lake was a shared resource she had the right to assign. But I could see the weakness under all of it. The new docks sat too neatly on land that had never been fully reviewed. The permits she bragged about only covered part of the structure, not the water system beneath it. And every time I checked a record, I found another small mismatch, another detail that suggested the board had moved faster than its knowledge. That was the real reason I stayed quiet. I wasn't avoiding conflict. I was waiting until I had enough proof to make her story collapse under its own weight. Linda thought I was simply being difficult. In reality, I was watching her build a trap with her own hands, and the tighter she pulled it, the more obvious it became that one day soon she was going to step into it herself. The more I read, the more the pattern sharpened. The HOA had not just overstepped once or twice. It had been moving in the wrong direction for months, maybe longer, and every document I found made that harder to deny. The Marina permits covered the dock structure, but not the water control system beneath it. The board minutes talked about shared lake access, as if repeating the phrase could make it true. And the easement notes, buried in county language most people would never bother to decode, made a different point entirely. The basin had been protected long before the neighborhood was ever built. That meant Linda wasn't just stretching the rules. She was building a project on top of a boundary she had never bothered to verify. I started tracing the private trust behind the lake, line by line, page by page. It took time because the records were old and the language was intentionally dry, the kind of paperwork designed to discourage curiosity. But when I finally found the control reference, everything clicked into place. There was a regulated outflow tunnel tied to the lake system, and the records showed it had been maintained under private conservation oversight for years. That was the part Linda never mentioned in her emails, never brought up in meetings, never included in the glossy Marina brochure. She talked about the shoreline, the dock, the access points. She never talked about the mechanism that made the lake itself possible. The HOA had built its entire argument around appearance, while the actual authority sat somewhere else entirely. What bothered me most was how easily the neighborhood accepted it. People saw a finished dock, a few polished signs, and a ribbon-cutting event, and they decided that was enough proof. No one asked the simple questions: who owns the basin, who manages the water level, who approved the infrastructure under the surface. Linda counted on that. She knew most people would confuse confidence with legitimacy, and she was good at performing confidence. Every time she spoke, she sounded more certain than the facts around her, and that was enough to keep the crowd on her side. I let her have that illusion for a while because the best way to expose someone like Linda is not to argue too early. It is to let them commit fully, let them spend the money, let them build the structure, let them say the words in front of witnesses. Once they've done all of that, the truth hits harder. By the end of that week, I had enough to know the Marina was vulnerable, but I still didn't move. I kept one hand on the records and one eye on the neighborhood, waiting for the moment Linda would make her mistake in public. She was already too confident, already too invested, and that made her predictable. She thought I was quiet because I was defeated. In reality, I was quiet because I had finally found the one thing she could not fake her way through: the paperwork that proved she never had the right to claim the water in the first place. And once that became visible, everything she had built would stop looking like a community project and start looking like what it really was: a very expensive assumption waiting for its collapse. The Marina opening was exactly the kind of event Linda loved because it let her turn control into theater. By the time I arrived, the dock had been dressed up with fresh signs, neat banners, folding tables, and a ribbon stretched across the entrance like this was some kind of civic achievement instead of a rushed construction project built on assumptions nobody had bothered to verify. She moved through the crowd with that same polished confidence, smiling too widely, speaking too smoothly, and treating every handshake like proof that her version of the story had already won. The homeowners around her looked pleased, even proud, because the whole thing was being sold as progress, as if a marina automatically meant value, prestige, and community spirit. Linda knew exactly how to frame it. She used words like enhancement, access, and shared enjoyment, and she said them often enough that people stopped asking who had actually checked the property lines. I stood near the edge and listened to her talk about the lake as though it belonged to the neighborhood by default. That was her greatest talent. She could sound official even when she was speaking off a foundation of guesses. What made the day unsettling was how easily the crowd accepted her performance. People nodded when she explained the marina would benefit everyone. They smiled when she talked about upcoming events, boat slips, and new opportunities for residents. Nobody noticed that the paperwork behind it had never been explained clearly, or that the project had moved forward faster than the records could justify. Linda didn't need everyone to understand the legal details. She only needed them to feel invested before anyone looked too closely. And once they did, once they had attended the launch party, posted the pictures, and accepted the language of community as fact, they would be less likely to question it later. I saw the strategy clearly, and that was exactly why I stayed quiet. She was building emotional momentum around a structure that had not been fully verified. The prettier it looked, the more dangerous the collapse would be. At one point she spotted me near the back and gave a small, controlled smile, the kind people use when they think they've already won and want you to know they remember you were a problem. She didn't approach right away. She let the event continue, let the photographers get their shots, let the board members praise her in front of everyone. Then she came over and asked if I had come to see the marina. For myself. Her voice light, almost pleasant, but with that thin edge underneath that always told me she was testing whether I had finally accepted her authority. I told her it looked very well organized. That answer was enough to make her believe she still had the upper hand, because Linda liked responses that sounded neutral. She mistook restraint for surrender. What she didn't know was that I had already traced the permits, the trust records, and the drainage system far enough to understand exactly how exposed the entire project was. She was celebrating a structure built on a blind spot, and she was doing it in front of the whole neighborhood. By the time the event ended, the marina had become more than a project. It had become Linda's proof that she could reshape reality just by naming it. Confidently enough. That was the part one was waiting for. The more public the lie became, the more public the correction would be when it came. I watched her stand at the dock, smiling for photos, and I knew she had reached the point where turning back would make her look weak. So she wouldn't turn back. She would push harder, keep calling it a community success, keep acting like the lake had always been part of her plan. And that meant the next step was already inevitable. She had tied her reputation to the marina, her authority to the project, and her pride to the idea that nobody could challenge her without challenging the entire neighborhood. That kind of confidence is fragile. It looks solid until the first crack appears. And when that crack finally showed, it would not be small enough for her to ignore. Before making my next move, I focused on the part Linda never expected anyone to look at, the system underneath the lake, not the image on top of it. The outflow records were hidden in old conservation documents, the kind of paperwork that sits in county archives for years because no one thinks it matters until the day it suddenly does. What those records showed was simple enough to read but dangerous enough to change everything. The lake basin was tied to a controlled drainage system, and that system had been governed under private trust management long before the subdivision existed. In other words, the HOA could decorate the shoreline, install signs, and host ribbon-cutting events all it wanted, but it did not control the water itself. It never had. Linda had built her entire marina project on a false assumption, and the deeper I read, the clearer it became that she had never bothered to confirm what she was standing on. That was the first thing that mattered. The second was the key. It wasn't some dramatic object meant to look mysterious. It was simply the physical proof that access to the system existed and that someone, somewhere, had real authority over it. The record showed a regulated outlet tied to the basin, a mechanism designed to manage water level during heavy rainfall and seasonal overflow. The trust documentation showed that access to that system was restricted and tracked. And the ownership language made one thing unmistakable: the HOA did not get to vote its way into control. That mattered because Linda's whole style was based on making people feel that numbers, meetings, and majority opinions could replace legal reality. She believed if enough residents approved something, then the truth would eventually catch up and agree with her. But water rights do not work that way. Property does not work that way. And a private conservation system certainly does not become common property just because someone prints it on a flyer and calls it community enhancement. I kept the discovery to myself, because I wanted one thing more than I wanted confrontation. I wanted timing. If Linda was going to be exposed, she needed to be exposed after she had fully committed. After the marina was built. After the neighborhood had celebrated. After she had spent money, promised benefits, and talked too confidently in front of too many witnesses. That was the mistake people like her always make. They believe repetition creates legitimacy. So I let her repeat herself. I let her keep selling the marina as though it were hers to offer. I let the board keep acting like approval was the same thing as ownership. The more public they made it, the weaker their position became. What I also understood, and what Linda had not yet realized, was that this wasn't only about legal control. It was about perception. The marina looked complete, the dock looked polished, and the crowd around it looked convinced. That gave her confidence. But confidence is dangerous when it depends on everyone else staying uninformed. Once the truth reaches the right set of eyes, the whole performance changes shape. And I was close enough now to know exactly when that shift would happen. The documents were there, the trust was there, and the system was there, waiting under all the noise. Linda thought she was building a neighborhood amenity. What she had actually built was a public mistake, and the moment it surfaced, she would no longer be able to hide behind the language of community. The next morning, everything changed. The lake had completely disappeared, and the whole neighborhood seemed to wake up at once, as if the silence itself had triggered the alarm. People came out onto their porches, walked toward the dock, and stopped in disbelief the moment they saw the basin exposed under the sun. Where there had been water the night before, there was now only cracked mud, dry earth, and the stranded Marina sitting uselessly in the open like a stage set after the actors had left. Boats leaned at strange angles, some half buried, some tilted so far they looked ready to collapse into the dirt. The polished dock that Linda had celebrated just yesterday now stretched out over nothing, its purpose stripped away in a single night. The entire scene felt wrong in the way a dream feels wrong once you realize you are awake. Linda arrived fast, faster than anyone else, her heels striking the wood with a sharp, impatient rhythm that sounded almost angry at the dock itself for existing. She stopped at the edge and stared down at the empty basin, her face shifting through disbelief, irritation, and then a kind of defensive confusion that she tried hard to hide. For a few seconds she did not speak at all. That alone told me more than any explanation could have. This was not supposed to happen inside her version of the world. The Marina had been her proof that she was in control, her evidence that the neighborhood trusted her judgment, and now the lake had vanished beneath the very structure she had spent months promoting. Behind her, people started whispering. Some were calling county offices. Others were already blaming a pipe burst, drought, sabotage, or some kind of mechanical failure. Nobody knew what to believe because nobody expected the truth to arrive in a form this dramatic. I stood quietly and watched the confusion spread. Linda finally turned toward the crowd and started speaking in the same calm, managerial voice she used when she wanted authority to sound like procedure. She said the HOA would investigate. She said there must have been a systems failure. She said everyone should remain calm and wait for official confirmation. But her voice didn't carry the way it usually did. The emptiness around us swallowed it. Without the water, her words sounded smaller, less certain, almost fragile. I could see her trying to hold the moment together before it slipped completely away from her. Then she saw me. The look she gave was not one of surprise exactly, but recognition mixed with suspicion, as if some part of her had already begun connecting the scene to the documents she had ignored. She asked me whether I knew what had happened. I didn't answer right away. I simply reached into my pocket and touched the key I had carried all this time, the one she never understood and never respected. That was enough to make her expression tighten. The crowd noticed the change too. People who had been confident 10 minutes earlier suddenly looked uncertain, then uneasy, then quietly afraid of what they might have missed. Phones came out. Photos were taken. Calls were made. The Marina, which had looked like progress yesterday, now looked like evidence. And Linda, standing there at the edge of the dry basin, was starting to understand that the story she had told everyone was no longer holding together. The lake had not just disappeared. It had exposed the weakness underneath everything she had built. And for the first time, she was standing in a place where her authority could not save her. The first real crack in Linda's story came when the county records started matching what I had found. One of the residents had already pulled the easement file, and once the document was opened on a phone screen in front of everyone, the room changed. The basin was listed under a private conservation trust, not under the HOA, and the drainage system that controlled the lake level was marked as restricted infrastructure. That meant the marina had been built on a structure the board never fully understood, let alone owned. Linda tried to interrupt before the implications landed, but the more she spoke, the worse it sounded. She kept saying the HOA had approved everything, that the residents had supported the project, that the county had signed off on the permits. But the permits only covered the dock itself, not the water system beneath it, and that detail was enough to pull the entire argument apart. People began comparing notes in real time. One person checked the old subdivision map. Another opened a scanned record from the county archive. Someone else found the trust reference number and read it out loud. Piece by piece, the neighborhood was discovering that the lake had never been a simple community amenity. The shoreline could be discussed in board meetings, but the water management belonged somewhere else entirely. That was the part Linda had either ignored or never bothered to learn. She had treated the lake like a backdrop for her project, when in fact it was governed by a separate legal structure that existed long before she ever moved into the neighborhood. And now that truth was out in the open, every confident speech she had given started to sound reckless. I finally stepped forward and explained what the records actually meant. The trust had the authority to regulate the basin, and the outflow system was part of a controlled conservation network. The HOA had no right to claim the water as shared property, no right to market the marina as an amenity tied to ownership, and no right to act surprised when the system was used according to its actual governing rules. I kept my tone calm because there was no need to raise my voice. The documents were already doing the work. The more clearly I laid it out, the less room Linda had to hide inside vague phrases like community value and resident approval. People began looking at her differently, not with anger yet, but with the cold realization that she had been acting with confidence she never earned. Linda still tried to hold her ground. She insisted the HOA had acted in good faith, that the neighborhood had relied on the project, that the situation could be resolved internally. But that was the wrong word. Internally only worked when the problem belonged to the system speaking. This one didn't. It had crossed into ownership, jurisdiction, and liability, and those words had a different kind of weight. The marina was no longer a symbol of progress. It was an example of what happens when people confuse a polished appearance for actual authority. And by the time the last document was read aloud, everyone standing there understood the same thing. Linda had not just made a bad decision. She had built a public project on a foundation she never verified, and now the whole neighborhood was watching that mistake collapse in real time. By that afternoon, there was nothing left of Linda's version of the story. The marina was officially shut down, the county had opened a formal review, and the residents who had spent weeks praising the project were now walking around with the same uneasy expression, the look of people realizing they had trusted confidence instead of facts. Linda tried one last time to frame everything as a misunderstanding, but the words no longer had any weight. The trust records were real. The drainage system was real. The permits only covered part of the structure, and the rest had been built on assumptions she never checked. That was the part she could never talk her way around. What happened next was not dramatic in the way Linda liked to make things dramatic. There was no speech that saved her, no sudden reversal, no last-minute excuse that could make the paperwork disappear. There was only process, and process was colder than she expected. The marina had to be reassessed. The legal exposure had to be reviewed. The HOA's authority over the project was suspended until the property lines, water rights, and conservation trust were all sorted out correctly. People started talking less about the lake and more about insurance, liability, and who had signed what. That shift mattered more than any shouting match could have. It meant the neighborhood had stopped treating Linda like the person with answers. I did not feel victorious so much as finished. I had spent weeks letting her build the illusion until it could not survive contact with reality, and now that reality had arrived. The lake would be restored to regulated conditions, the marina would come down, and every decision Linda made would be examined through the lens of what she had failed to verify. She had believed community approval was enough. She had believed confidence could replace ownership. She had believed the loudest voice in the room could define the truth. None of that held up. Once the records were read, as the sun went down, people drifted away from the dry basin in small groups, quieter than they had been in the morning. The empty lake no longer looked like a shock. It looked like a correction. Linda stayed behind for a while, standing near the dock as if waiting for the scene to undo itself, but it never did. The system underneath the water had done what it was designed to do, and all her control had done was make the fallout bigger. In the end, that was the real lesson. If you build on something you never verified, eventually the truth will pull the ground out from under you.